President and Dr. Biden, President and Mrs. Bush, Vice Presidents Harris, Pence, Quayle, and Gore, distinguished guests and friends, we gather today in this holy and magnificent space 1 week before Thanksgiving to give thanks for the life of Richard Bruce Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States, and to thank his family, Mrs. Cheney, Liz, Mary, Phil, Heather, Elizabeth, Kate, Grace, Sam, Philip, Sarah, and Richard. Thank them for sharing him with us. I'm Jonathan Reiner, and I was privileged to be the Vice President's cardiologist. I'll admit, I'm not very good at letting go. But it can take a village to care for a complicated patient, and I want to acknowledge the many doctors and nurses here with us today who took such magnificent care of the Vice President. Over a span of 27 years, Vice President Cheney gifted me with his trust, and there's nothing more sacred between a doctor and their patient than trust. I'm happy to report that I haven't given many eulogies. No one wants a doctor who's great at funerals. But I stand here this morning deeply honored to tell you about my remarkable patient, Dick Cheney. 20 years before I met the Vice President, his career in elected office almost ended before it began when he suffered a heart attack during his first campaign for Congress. He was only 37. What Dick Cheney didn't know at the time, because his doctors never told him, was that they thought it would be best for him to withdraw from the race, that after the heart attack, a vigorous campaign might be too much for him. They didn't know Dick Cheney, or more likely, maybe they did know Dick Cheney, and no one had the guts to tell him to quit. So after a period of rest, he told Wyoming's voters that he was up for the challenge. He said a little hard work never hurt anybody. And later in the summer, he resumed his campaign, won that election, and then 5 more. For a man with very complex heart disease, the Vice President was the easiest patient to care for. He was meticulously compliant with his prescribed treatment. As it pertained to his health, he lived by the motto, when in doubt, check it out. He never allowed politics to influence his personal health care decisions, and not once in all my time as his doctor did he try to write or change a single word of a statement I issued. There was only one time in my entire tenure with the Vice President that he said no to a medical recommendation from me. It was on September 11th, 2001. I had an appointment to see him that day at the White House for a scheduled checkup. I don't typically make house calls, but sometimes I'm willing to make an exception. In advance of the visit, my colleague, Colonel Lou Hoffman, the Vice President's wonderful full-time White House doctor, had arranged for some routine blood tests. But before the tubes could be sent to the lab, our world changed. Amazingly, even with the chaos and horror of that day, somehow late in the afternoon, the blood samples found their way to a lab. In the early evening, while the Vice President was on the move to an undisclosed location, Lou called to tell me that our patient's potassium level was dangerously, maybe even lethally high. I thought that the result was probably erroneous, an artifact of the prolonged delay in processing the blood, but we needed to be sure. I was worried about him. I asked Lou if we could repeat the test right away, but the Vice President firmly said, no, not today. I didn't think that was the day to argue with him. You might think that taking care of a public figure, particularly one who carried nuclear launch codes, could be a bit intimidating. But the Vice President was an unassuming man. His calls to me, even when originating from the White House, always began in the same modest way. Hi, John, it's Dick Cheney. Prior to the 2000 election, one of my young cardiology fellows, who somehow had never heard of Dick Cheney, asked the soon-to-be Vice President of the United States what he did for a living. The soon-to-be Vice President answered, government work. He was also very grateful and very generous. Prior to taking office in 2001, the Vice President, Mrs. Cheney, quietly donated a large gift to George Washington University, which became the founding support for our Heart Institute, enabling us to provide defibrillators to churches in the poorest parts of the nation's capital and pacemakers to patients in the poorest parts of the world. In his 2006 eulogy for President Ford, Vice President Cheney referred to his boss, the 38th President of the United States, as the still point in the turning wheel. It's a beautiful image derived from a passage in a T.S. Eliot poem. I remember hearing his words then and thinking how aptly the phrase described the Vice President himself. In all our time together, in moments of true existential risk for him, the Vice President was always the calmest person in the room, including me. One evening in July 2010, as he lay literally dying in the cardiac surgical intensive care unit, I told the Vice President that the mechanical heart assist device scheduled for the next day couldn't wait until morning. It would be too late. He looked for a moment towards Miss Cheney, Liz, and Mary, and then said calmly, "Okay, let's do it." That's all he said. "Okay, let's do it." Months later, as he recalled that night, he said that he thought he would probably die, and he was at peace with it. The Latin word for heart is cor. It's also the source for the word courage. To have heart is to have courage. I don't think courage is necessarily the absence of fear. Rather, it's the ability to persevere even in the presence of fear. Time and time again, that's what Vice President Cheney was able to do. His wasn't a false courage cloaked by a thin veneer of bravado, but rather a genuine fortitude in the face of true mortal peril. He lived most of his adult life chased by a relentless disease intent on killing him, but he never looked over his shoulder. He only looked ahead. The hospitalization to implant the ventricular assist device was long and complicated. He was in the ICU for more than a month, but not for a single moment without his family watching over him. When I entered his ICU room on his sickest days, I would often find Mrs. Cheney at the base of the bed, rubbing his feet. Liz and Mary took turns sleeping in the hospital. He just barely survived. But the device ultimately enabled him to recover and last the 20 months until he was gifted with a new heart. Today, as we remember the Vice President's life, I ask you also to think about the anonymous family who, in their time of terrible grief 13 years ago, donated the heart of someone they treasured to a stranger they would never know. It was a blessing and an act of love. A gift that gave him many more summer afternoons on the Snake River with his fly rod, and most profoundly, precious time to watch his 7 grandchildren grow up. This was what was most important to Dick Cheney. At a recent birthday party, he told them, "I am so proud of all of you." He was an American patriot and a man who loved his family. I was honored to be his doctor. It was an even greater honor to be his friend.